Awesome. We have a couple people on. Okay, anyone want to read the planning, landing knowledgeable? Okay.
I can make it up.
Yeah, I got it right here.
I got it. I usually have my paper copies. We'd like to acknowledge we are on the traditional land of a rich and diverse group of Native peoples who have called this area home for more than 10,000 years. We honor with gratitude the land itself and the descendants of these Native peoples who are still here today.
Yeah, thank you. Is there a motion to approve the agenda?
I move to approve the agenda.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Anyone opposed? Cool. Okay, the March 12th meeting minutes, just one item. Looks like Cherie did a magic trick and she was present and absent.
I saw that. I got that too.
I was like, she's good at it.
I feel like that in most meetings.
Yeah, well, physically.
Was that, did that happen to Maddie too? Cause I thought I saw that for Maddie too.
Yeah, she was, present and absent.
Okay, I'll make those changes.
Cool. Did anybody have any comments about the meeting minutes?
There's, I don't have it in front of me, but on the last page, I believe, it seems to, and I don't know if that was, like, if anybody's ever going to read these minutes, but it seems to me that I'm suggesting to the Climate Council Committee that they need a consultant to address their what was it?
Yeah, the equity.
Yeah,
Language.
equity that that I'm telling them they need to. I was simply reporting that they are
Sure.
bringing on a consultant. to
Yeah.
do that one.
Yeah, that's right. That
Changed.
Thank you.
was clear. Okay. Anybody else? Okay. If there's no additional comments, does somebody want to make a motion to approve with the mentioned edits?
So
Second? Second. All in favor? Any opposed? Alrighty. Meeting dates, so we are coming back there in just a few days on Tuesday the 9th. Was there anybody that couldn't make that one? I'm trying to recall.
Yeah, I can't.
David cannot and Lois cannot. Okay. So we're down to, we don't know about Melissa and Maddie.
So far, they're in for Tuesday.
So far they're
Not today, yeah.
okay. Great. The 9th, 7 o'clock, same place. Okay, we have public, obviously we do in person, but online as well. Well. Talk about any public comments, would you like to go, Sarah?
Hello, my name is Sarah Phillips. I'm live at what do I have to say on that? 185 from the St. Avenue Northeast. I'm the chair of the Climate Action Committee, and we just wanted to sneak into your agenda through the public comment. And I just wanted to remind you that the City of Lake Forest Park Council has adopted by resolution a commitment to reduce emissions by 50% by 2030. As have the other cities, most of the other cities in King County, for the King County Climate Collaborative Cities, Climate Counties, Cities Collaborative, something like that. Okay, 4 Cs. When we look at that, when we say that you're going to reduce by 50%, it's a stunning number. But a significant portion of that is the federal government's going to do, the state government's going to do, the county government's going to do, but there is a significant portion of the commitment to reduction of greenhouse gases that the City of Lake Forest Park is committed to reducing. So we think it's really critical that as you look at the comp plan, that you remember that the city council has committed to reducing greenhouse gases. And we're hoping that the document reflects that. And we've had a number of sort of presentations where you had suggested that we integrate the issues that we saw as climate issues into the existing elements of the comp plan. And we have done that, and we've given it to your consultant. So what we have done is taken all of our actions, our strategies and actions, and held them in one hand, and held in the other hand the 2015 comp plan, and not the corrections or wind up versions that you've done. And we've said to ourselves, where does this strategy belong in your in the comp plan? And we've identified both a policy, when it would go in the existing policy, or if we thought there was a new policy that needed to be developed. We also had some that we thought, well, we can hold off on those. Not very many, because of course we thought all the work we did was critical. Our work has been much more, as you know, more action oriented than yours as policy oriented, but we did think that that integration was possible. We sent a copy of this document to Mark, and we sent it to Christina. So she should have it to be able to assist you in seeing how we thought the issues of climate needed to be integrated into the document. I do want to say that I realize it makes more work, but we believe it's absolutely critical that the policy document the city adopts holds up a mirror to the commitment that the city's made to reduce greenhouse gases. Thank you.
So may I ask a clarifying question? So our consultant made recommendations, right, which we reviewed, and then she introduced to all of you as well. So just to be clear, how did you address those recommendations?
We took what she had and we thought that was great, but we had more.
You had more, okay.
Yes, so we looked at all of ours. We thought the work we had done was so good that you should look at all of it. Now, you may decide that that is not the case, but we looked at the kinds of issues that we had raised and integrated all of them. We took the issues that Christina had raised for us, but we thought there were additional, and it was sort of the issues that you had raised here in our conversations before this notion of the integration.
Okay, thanks, sir.
So logistically speaking, would we see that second round of edits the next meeting?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, tonight's material, possibly fair and fair strikeout underlines if we get them tomorrow. But definitely that CAC memo.
Okay.
So it's a lot of material, but it'll all be forwarded when we do the agenda tomorrow. We have it poised and ready. The only uncertainty is, will Fair and Pierce transportation strikeout underlines come in tomorrow, over the weekend, or Monday?
Okay.
But whenever we get them, we'll forward them.
And they will be in our meeting on Tuesday.
Late Leland.
We will, okay.
Christina has a family issue, so she'll be gone.
Okay.
May not make it back by Tuesday night.
Okay.
But Leland and housing is tonight's discussion is the primary for next Tuesday, and whatever time is left, we can apply to those two other issues. And one of them is the no.
And I think Christine did say that we might have to come back to it after these.
Yeah, and when it was, to Sarah's credit, when it was shared, Christina asked, can we go ahead and share it now with the consultants? That's been done. The timing issue is that now we're going to share it with the planning commission while they go to city council and talk, discuss, and get the climate action plan approved. And so we're not waiting, because if we do, we're out of time. So it's been shared, but we're kind of balancing that it's not an approved document, but we're assuming we're heading towards that. So we didn't want to hold the consultants up for you.
Thanks. Like a juggling.
It is, but it doesn't, it's not as hard as it sounds, I think. Because the policy elements that are in there can be wrapped into the periodic update. And the climate action plan is largely an implementation and action item So it's two different things. So the periodic update can include whatever you think is the policy from the climate action plan can be part of your recommendation and then adopted in by December. And then, well, I'll stop there. It gets more confusing with the climate element, which is a whole nother year. That's coming.
Any other questions for Sarah? Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. The intern. Bye, thanks. Any additional comments online? Jonathan? Yeah, I was gonna say, do give us one moment here. Magical wand.
Attendees.
There.
There we go.
You wanna give us a test, Jonathan?
Test, can you hear me?
Sure can.
Hi, Commissioners. Jonathan Lowndes from the Master Builders Association of King and Snohomish Counties. I just wanted to emphasize the importance of the middle housing discussion that's going to be taking place. We're facing a housing attainability and affordability crisis in our region, and middle housing really allows an opportunity to help alleviate some of the issues that we're seeing. So I sent some recommendations over to the commissioners regarding middle housing. And I just wanted to say I'm looking forward to working with Lake Forest Park as you guys help address some of the housing affordability and attainability issues in our region. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments online? Okay, did I see, council member?
She's remote tonight.
I did see.
Actually, no, what do we call it? Not deputy,
Oh, deputy mayor.
deputy mayor. Oh, no. Oh, you're on a mute.
Hey,
I don't like that necklace.
Yeah, thank you. I had to have some neck surgery a week ago, and so I'm wearing my lovely undecorated necklace here. So my voice is a little huskier than usual too. So I'm not joining you in person today just because you know, I'm still kind of recovering, but everything's going smoothly. I have no problem, so thanks. A few updates to share with you. First of all, the council did adopt the master plan design for the park that was recommended by the Parks and Recreation Board. And so we're moving ahead on that to apply for state grants that are on 2-year cycles where the grant applications are due May 1st. So we're moving ahead to try to pursue funding for a lot of the waterfront features and the land preservation and improvement features of that proposal. So we'll see how that goes. We're cautiously optimistic because we think we have a really good design and a good project that's quite worthy. Second, we are finally taking up the sign ordinance recommendations from the Planning Commission. I forget how long ago that was, but it keeps bumping off of priority. But our community development director is coming to remind us what you guys recommended shortly. So we'll have 3 touches again, and then probably move to adoption. So that will be good to check off that box finally after all that time. Last but not least, the council had its annual retreat recently, and we discussed what we thought were some of the emerging issues that were high priority for us to deal with in the upcoming years. And we will have a report coming out, but just to give you some of the highlights, I think we highlighted multimodal mobility, but with an emphasis for our community on sidewalks and walkways and bicycle pathways. So the point is that not that we want a lot more transit through our city or more traffic through our city, we want more ways for people to get around without cars or even big buses. So we're looking for ways to do that. Related to that is also traffic calming. And we are kind of concerned that with the construction going on at 145th, we're going to see a big increase in cut through traffic and traffic in general, just numbers of cars on Bothell Way and Ballinger. And that's supposed to go on for 7 months. So we're looking into that. As part of traffic safety, we're also looking into the possibility of additional speed cameras for traffic regulation. There is new state legislation. It's so complicated on that. I can't tell you much more other than that the council's very interested in this and we're exploring what some of the possibilities and timing might be. Because we do think there's an awful lot of fast driving that's going on in a lot of both the major highways, but also the cut through routes are experiencing a lot. The second issue or third issue, depending on how you want to look at it, is middle housing and affordability. The council knows we're going to get recommendations from you, but it still is high on our list of how do we make sure that we deal with state legislation in a way that fits with the character, environment, and values of Lake Forest Park. Implementing the climate action plan was also on our list. When we have more information and we actually have our report, I'll share it with you, but you wouldn't be surprised at the issues. Some of the issues you're dealing with in the comprehensive plan were issues that the council was flagging for our own action. And last but not least, it's getting our finances in order because, you know, some of you may know this, every year, the revenue sources that we have are quite limited, and yet our actual expenses are higher. And especially for public safety and policing, we've had a lot of big increases in the costs that we have, whether it's for you know, emergency dispatch services or paying for jail for when we have to put people in jail, or paying for public defenders. Excuse me. Those are all things where the costs have gone up, you know, way more than our revenue increases. And we're about to embark this, you know, late spring on starting to work on our new biennial budget for 2025 and 2026. So I think the city council believes that we need to make sure we're not dependent every year on kind of emergency grant funds, and try to see if we can get on a more sustainable footing by taking a fresh look at our revenues and opportunities. So that's a little more probably than you wanted to know, but anyway, know that the work you're doing is very central to the council's priorities going forward too. So we're really looking forward to your work. That's it. Any questions? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ready. So, old business. We're gonna spend our time talking about housing study, I think, probably for most of tonight. We have under transportation and climate, but I think we'll get to that, or is there anything for sure you can touch on with those?
Yeah, we left them on because, I don't even know what day it is.
We were hopeful we'd get materials, but
Yeah,
Okay, okay,
on packet day, we were waiting and waiting, so like, let's put a placekeeper on there.
just,
And, but we can handle with this, we're waiting hour by hour for the strikeout underline of the transportation element. I'd love to see it. Just haven't gotten it yet, but it's coming. Climate, the update we just got with Sarah's.
okay. Great. Well, we have a big chunk of time to talk about housing, and we have some strikeout language. I guess maybe to start, unless somebody has a different idea, if we wanna hop to page 3 and 4, maybe we can start talking through some of these questions.
3 and 4 of what?
Of the, sorry, 3 and 4 of the, housing element, middle housing discussion guide.
Right.
Yeah, from Christina.
Back in page 10 and 11.
So the first one, housing supply and diversity, they had a lot of bullet points in here for expanding the language or saying strengthening the language. In one instance, it's adding a complete new policy again to try and touch on that equity language that we are required to do. By these 10 bullet points, is there anything anybody wants to unpack or talk about? Any questions, issues, suggestions?
I'd say I ended up, I mean, I looked at the discussion guide, but then I just wanted to dive deep into the.
Actual language.
Yeah, the report and the actual language stuff, so I don't.
Is that gonna be more fruitful? Is that kind of what everybody else thinks? If so, we can just go straight to language.
I just have a question about ADUs real quickly, given the work that we did on ADUs.
Yeah.
Are there requirements that we have, are the changes that we made or the recommendations that we made suffice, or do we have to go back to that?
They suffice locally for that effort. Now, I believe it's House Bill 1220 allows 2 ADUs.
That's, okay,
That's going to be the specific next step.
yeah, okay, that makes sense.
Yeah. And I think it's 2 House bills. My brain is fried,
Yeah.
1337 and 1220, if you're keeping score at all.
Lois, you good if we jump to the actual red line? Yep, okay. Great. I guess maybe we'll want to flag that next page 5 where we have a couple options there, 1, 2,
Yes.
3, and 4. Maybe let's just park it there for a second, or we can come back. That on page 5, the middle housing, we're given 1 through 4 options about how do we want to address middle housing. Option 1 is limited to just 2 units per lot in all residential areas. 2 is a little broader for 2 units in specific zones, 2 specific zones. 3 is even more, and then 4 is allow more than 2 units everywhere throughout the city. So, yeah, a little to a lot. Does anybody have any strong feelings you want to throw out there?
I'm not for option 4.
Not for option 4 myself, yeah. Okay.
But I would consider option 2 an option.
Mhm.
I was a little, I was kind of wishing for a more nuanced option. In this case, specifically around this issue of, like, I agree with some of the approaches they took on their recommendations generally, like maybe allow a broader suite of types in these zones. I don't know if didn't get deep enough to say, yes, this is exactly what I want, but I appreciated that guidance. But I also think we could be considering, even in some of the areas they didn't highlight, I think there are some types of middle housing that could be really appropriate. And specifically, I'm thinking about the need for small, self-contained, like, whether you call them cottage or not, but cottage type housing, which I think that could, in my view, be appropriate anywhere. And I think to incentivize it, you'd need to allow more than 2 units to have a pencil out. So I just feel like there's some of it, like 2 and 3 look pretty good. And I'd like to, at some point, spend time specifically on how we might incentivize certain types of middle housing that could apply more broadly. Not be tied to just transit distance and things like that, but I've heard a lot from community members that one thing they really see missing are, homes, not duplex, triplex, but singles, but small and accessible and affordable, which could be like cottage housing. And why wouldn't we consider, or I'd like to see us consider, incentives around that could apply, theoretically almost anywhere, in any zone. I just don't think I don't think that needs to be limited to near Ballinger or Bothell. So I can't pick one because I feel like there's some things missing, but I appreciate it with it together.
There was some controversy around the cottage housing and and more dense housing, and that seems to have sort of died off, but I would be curious to know the reasons why that was so controversial.
Do you mean back when, like years ago when it was being?
So, yeah, there was-
Shoreline and stuff, or are you
I
talking
mean, it
about
wasn't
something
in
else?
shoreline, it was a proposed bill in
was
the
here.
LFP, and it was allowed by code, and it was, basically, more dense. Single, like you're talking about, single units within one lot, and,
Right.
yeah, they just, for whatever reason, the neighborhood sort of just. Really opposed the idea, so I don't know, that, I don't hear a lot of that talk anymore, but it was there and it was strong at the time.
Well, I think that was probably outside of a comp plan process. It was in a special.
It was a,
special
specific
use thing.
development, yeah.
So to me, I think we shouldn't duck that conversation just because it was, got maybe tense last time. I think when you're doing a comp plan, that's when you should talk about it and have the time to talk about it and kind of explore what's behind people's objections, if they have those objections. I mean, like, to me, if I think about some of the neighborhoods, I kind of go, ooh, I don't know if I want to see let's say a sixplex, but I could totally imagine a 6-unit cottage development. To me, those are totally different. Like the mass of a sixplex is totally different to me than a, single story or a story and a half, clustered housing on some of these, big lots we have. Specifically, I'd like to, and they mentioned some ideas like this in here later, but I'd like to see that done on a, basically a density bonus. Like, it's like, okay, like everywhere we have to allow 2 units, right? That we know, states told us that we got to allow 2 units of some kind. But if we think that the form and scale and affordability of, say, cottage type housing is an important thing to go after, then why wouldn't we consider allowing double density if that's what you develop? So 4 units instead of 2, for example. That's just an example, but I'd like to see us consider things like that.
Maybe if they have appropriate landscaping or.
Well, yeah, and I wouldn't want to you still got to follow all our environmental protection stuff,
Yeah.
same tree code, same critical areas, but there are properties where you can totally do it. So, yeah, I don't want to dwell on that right now, but that's my comment on this table. I think there's some nuances between those options.
So also keep in mind, though, the survey's gone out. So
Yeah.
we have public opinion that will be coming to us.
Absolutely.
Their thoughts on the same, exactly, I mean, similar to what you're saying. Like,
Yeah. Yeah, no, I'm curious to see what kind of stuff we get.
So I think, well, at least for me too, option 1 and 4 were just kind of no's. As everyone kind of honing in on option 2 and 3. Understanding that we might want to refine that a little further.
Should we consider utilities like drainage, just all of the things, the infrastructure that would be needed? Because it would be terrible for us to say, 4 and then, 4 on these lots and then not have thought through, that our utilities are overloaded. So I would really, I'm not necessarily opposed to it. I just want to make sure that we are wise and that we've thought through the implications before we, just do something.
keeping in mind there's unintended consequences.
Exactly, yeah, what are the consequences and, to the storm drains, to the,
Yeah.
even to parking, to just all of those things. And
Yeah, they bring that up in some of their stuff, the parking one. they
yes, I know the
mentioned.
parking
Yeah.
one, and, that's something that we're already seeing, a lot of traffic in the city, and that will definitely exacerbate it.
Well, and I think we could spend a lot of time talking about how do we create this, how do we do this, but realistically, if it's not feasible from a financial perspective to build on this and to create those kinds of things, no one's gonna do that, and I say that because I've been on the building side before, and it's the dollars and cents need to make, so to have it be really fruitful, I think that's another element to think about as well.
That kind of reminds me of something that I had spoken to Maddie about one time is I would love to see maybe some builders, because there are already plots of land that could be developed.
Yeah.
What are the hindrances to
Why
those?
are they not?
Why are they not? And so anyway, I would love
That's
pre-code.
Yeah, that was,
Even
Root zone clearances.
what about, in the Southern Gateway? Why, because what are the,
There's design standards, I think a lot of people get turned off by, they're pretty stringent. But also too, I don't know about maybe their project, maybe it's not gonna make enough form, I don't know.
hey, yeah, look,
I had a question. How did they come up with, I guess, limiting it to the RS 7.2 and RS 15 zones? Do you know, Mark, or?
I think a
Oh,
lot of it is
to-
about their proximity to transit, so they looked at kind of how our zoning lays out with respect to Ballinger and 522. It kind of looked like walking distances to transit and to retail core. And then they just said that mostly looks to apply to these certain zones, but their report, the big report goes into more detail about that. So it wasn't about zoning per se, it was about location. Like where those zones happen to be in our city is I think the main.
there were also some zones that were more affected by steep slopes and
Right.
hindered with critical areas.
Critical.
Those were kind of taken out of, it was the RS 20 and 15, I would say, in the west.
And I know I was looking at the master builders, I live in the RS 15 zone, and it, relative to Lake Forest Park, it's kind of less canopied than other parts. But I guess the concern I would have from that perspective is, and I know the master builders, I saw the submittal. I am not a huge fan of the duplexes myself. They seem to be popping up all over the place, just aesthetically. And, I don't know if there's a way to kind of keep them lower story and encourage the cottage type housing. That would be just my input. So my concern would be, turning those zones into, as you drive through Shoreline, you see a lot of that type of housing development. And just aesthetically, I'm not a big fan of them. Thank you.
so I'm wondering if, because when we come back on Tuesday, they're gonna, ask how we feel about option 1 through 4, and it sounds like I don't think we wanna limit ourselves to this, so might I propose if you have some additional language to consider, that's something we can talk about deeper on Tuesday?
Yeah, I could write up kind of and it might be an option that, it's not a fifth option, it's kind of an option that we might consider almost anywhere.
Mhm.
But just to get the idea on the table. I'm
Yeah.
happy to do that.
Okay. And Meredith, you said something that I think we've had certain conversations with different people about, I know myself and Yanni talked about it too, as well as Maddie, but just understanding about the building and like what makes places attractive versus not. We understand it's not financially viable, but what about it isn't financially viable? Which kind of then goes into the language that you had talked about with incentives and, if growth is something that's important, how do we have language to incentivize it? So it's not something I don't think that we can, get on the schedule for next meeting, but just kind of want to flag it out there that I think that's something that's of concern to a lot of us because we're not all builders here. We don't understand. And so to understand those kinds of nuances, if there's a way to have a builder come in and talk to us for 20 minutes that says, hey, that'd be great for me to build this, but cost, size, parking, and this is why I will never build, and that would be, I think, fruitful for us to have that additional layer of understanding, as we kind of create, some of this, language, or help edit the language.
And you have more time. There's a lot of layers. Periodic update is definitely right now.
Yeah.
Through June, and then city council, and grab middle housing policy as you can. But then the House Bill 1110 specific middle housing is just starting.
Mhm.
That runs through June of 2025.
Okay.
So, and it's meant, the material is very related. Especially in policy. But it's very separate too, because it's two different grants, two different time periods, two different efforts. And if you couch it under middle housing and people coming in, can you build these types, which types fit in this community? You have more time than just April and May.
All right, so we'll kind of flag the options and we'll see some additional language for consideration next Tuesday. Do we want to hop to the language, to the red lines?
Actually, there's the critical areas, number 6.
Yes.
They also gave options.
Oh,
which
yes,
should,
1, 2, and 3.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Page 7 and 8 of the memo.
Now to make that more complicated, there's another layer to that. It seems, I apologize. Seems like it changes every 24 hours. It doesn't. The governor has signed House Bill
Yeah.
2321. That goes into effect June 6th of this year. One of the clarifications is to critical areas. This material was written before that signature and doesn't change what we're doing or looking at. But it's now clarified that whatever we put into the comprehensive plan, then our development codes, portions of lots with critical areas are now eligible. So I think this is written more towards, if there's a lot that has critical areas, it's out. That's not the case. It's portions of lots with critical areas.
as a result of the governor signing
Of this brand new session, yeah.
Okay, so when we're talking about proportions, right? So let's say, I don't know, there's a string, easy, there's a string on my property, but I want to add a couple of ADUs. I can do so long as it's not anything that.
Critical area or buffer. If you make that use and a permitted use, you can.
Based on the, although it has to be, well, middle housing, it has to meet those qualifications, right? Or are there,
Right now, whatever's allowed in that zone. So
whatever is allowed in that zone?
Exactly. So the permitted uses, conditional uses, and the RUE are allowed uses.
Okay.
Then middle housing comes along and says you must expand. So if you go to duplex, 3 ADUs, cottage housing, those become allowed types, but that critical area and buffer and RUE type structure still remain. Whereas I think the material for tonight was written with, well, it has a critical area and a buffer, so we don't need to add density there. The House Bill trailer bill that's now coming into effect while we're doing this portions. And yeah, and so Leland will be here Tuesday night to, I don't know if you checked your email, that's how fast. There's a punch list. They'll be here to explain that Tuesday night and how this 2321 affects these materials.
Yeah. So I won't be here at that evening. So the question that's particularly in my mind though is for Lake Forest Park, for some of these critical areas. At what point do we want to say, yes, let's, or do we have any choice in the matter? Because the governor signed, I mean, he's giving the option for some of these lots to be developed that would not, that we would have said no to before. See, I'm just trying to figure out, well, what's the difference? Because people.
What we would have been doing under the previous guidance is kind of creating 2 tracks, which right now we have 1.
Okay.
You have allowable uses, right? And we have rules around critical areas and their buffers. And then there's reasonable use. Okay, but basically everybody plays by those rules. What the original version would have allowed is for us to say, hey, any of our parcels that have a sliver of critical area, we can just say, those don't have to absorb any middle housing, whereas everybody else does.
Right.
That was the risk. I actually think the
Yeah.
second bill was smart. I think it did some things that I don't fully understand on some other fronts. But fixing this, I think, was really smart. It says, look, we're not telling you, you have to let people build in critical areas. But we're also telling you can't exempt an entire parcel just because there is a piece of critical area. I mean, in full disclosure, I sent a comment to actually our state legislator who serves this area, who was a sponsor of this bill. And said, thank you for fixing it. Because it was nonsensical. I actually think it was an oversight, to be honest, in the drafting of 1110. Meant with good intent, we're not encouraging building in critical areas, but I think the way they wrote it created this kind of weird loophole that cities could use to create a two-track system where people with critical areas suddenly don't have to accept any density, or you could see it as, or aren't allowed to add any density, depending on which side of the point of it.
So that totally makes sense to me. Then. So thank you for that. Right, so I think the question I still have is there any opportunity to jeopardize these critical zones, these critical areas, given these?
I sure hope not.
Right, and that's exactly, I don't want to just rely on hope, right?
Yeah.
I want to make sure that we're addressing whatever that might be, that might get in the way, that might jeopardize these critical areas, given these options that are now available. And I don't know.
We can make sure they don't, and to a large extent, they mirror state regulations. So it's not a free for all, let's decide how steep, or what these types and reduce that and favor housing. Really can't go that direction. I'm speaking in generalities, and you really can't go that direction. And so the balance is going to be how to implement House Bill 1110 and everything associated with it and fully preserve, like Nick said, tree code, critical areas code and shoreline master program that very much mirrors GMA. So there's little opportunity for a community to say, let's scrunch these that we have in our code right now to really favor this housing without really running up against some serious issues. So that balance though is going to be hard.
Would you see people being able to use reasonable use to argue that they need more units?
Absolutely.
Well, that to me is the one issue in this, I'm not sure how to think about that. I mean, adding another, if you look at the definition of reasonable use, adding a second unit is not, you don't have a right to do that.
It's a minimum development, right?
Minimum
That doesn't mean everything.
So, but I think you're right, we do need to address that so that it doesn't get sort of abused that, oh, now I'm gonna use reasonable use exemption to add a bunch more development. That encroaches on the critical area. No, I'm not for that, and I think we need to explicitly stop that. And maybe this is too simple, but the way I think about this whole puzzle with the critical areas and the housing is absolutely, let's look at what kind of housing we want to make possible and where, and let's not at all loosen our critical area protections to do it.
So what you're saying, so addressing.
It's kind of
this-
option 3, except
Yeah.
this RU thing I need to think about, but I'm like, maintain the existing regs, we don't need to soften the regs. Why would we do that? For environmental protection.
Nothing would fit. I mean, they're already, it's so tight already.
So,
It could be tried, they could say, well, an apartment is now permitted use, so I'm like minimum apartment
That's what I was-
development, right? And I'm gonna argue for it. And so I like your comment, let's make sure that in association with RUE and development standards, that's captured, because a minimum development right is not all the uses in a zone. It could be a single family home, and you can make it, like discussions we had, 750 square feet, standardize it. And I wasn't part of those discussions. I'm not saying do that, but that would be important to prevent the minimum development right becoming a 6-unit,
yeah,
6+.
I would think.
Go
we
ahead,
could
Lo-
clarify that.
Go ahead, Lois.
I was just thinking, if we go back to the previous discussion, if we did limit it to the RS 7200, well, and RS 1500, then that would kind of address that, wouldn't it? So that basically we would allow more development on those areas more, you know, if we chose option 2 or 3, or is there a conflict there? Or is that correct in assuming that? That is, if we chose to limit the additional housing units to RS 7200 and RS 1500, then that effectively basically steers critical areas out of that equation, because RS 7200 and RS 1500 are essentially outside of the critical areas.
No, the 15,000 actually has a lot. 15,000 has a lot. of
Sorry,
critical
this- Okay, so that wouldn't apply then if we were to,
I mean, I think they pointed out that there are certain zones that tend to have less critical area issues, like fewer creeks. Whereas like the 15,000 and 20,000, in some cases have the most of those, but they pointed at the 15,000 because of proximity to Ballinger. And not even all the 15,000, like a portion of the 15,000. So I think we need to separate those two topics. I think the zoning choice that they suggested, which I'm not sure I'm fully on board with, but was based more on where does it make sense to add density because of transportation and transit options. The critical area, I think we need to answer in a way that's kind of makes sense citywide, which is that whatever we decide on housing, my preference is that we're not going to reduce critical area protections in any zone from what they are now. That's where I hope we would land. Does that make sense? Did that clarify?
yeah, I guess I can see where it creates a lot of confusion though, because it's for me that, yeah, I understand what you're saying. And I guess it would require our critical, I mean, they would have to go through critical area, you know, the RUEs as you had mentioned anyways. So anyways, yeah, thank you.
Any comments, any additional comments on the options?
I guess it's number 3 to me, except for the RUE thing, we need to make sure we don't get sideways there. Yeah.
Certainly not.
Alrighty, do we want to take a look at the red line? Alright, any comments on? First one's just saying that is asking, should we add an introduction to goals and policies? Talking about the mention of the GMA requirements and state legislation.
Yeah.
I mean, I feel like we just want to check that box. right?
Staff has a suggestion, a summarized version, because then you go on our next document, which is the background analysis. That's the opportunity, and they have new language there. So if you make them consistent, then it really calls it out here in the element, but doesn't repeat everything background analysis. There's legislative.
So you're saying having those two languages, Mary Ann?
That'd be our suggestion. Not go without in the element, but not repeat what's in the background analysis. Background analysis has GMA, legislative, PSRC, King County planning policies, how we got there. And even that needs to be summarized. So, but I read this question as, should we talk about it at all here in the introduction? I think it's an important change from 2015.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Mhm.
I'd agree with that, but just briefly here and point to the background. Yeah, I like that.
Mhm.
And it's just the sort of thing, but it's called planning background, not planning context. People do not understand there's a difference, distinction between background context. So,
Hmm. Goals and policies. Anything stick out to anyone?
Do think that they're making an important distinction here again. Clustered development has been, kind of talked about that. It's been, I don't know, read an issue for people here in Lake Forest Park, but using the language of middle housing
Mhm.
infill is, I think, will change that perception out there. If there's any lingering concern for clustered housing.
There's a lot of equity language
Yeah.
woven through a lot of this.
I think it's really interesting that they're taking out preserving neighborhood character.
Ah,
Right?
Yeah, actually.
I hadn't really thought of it that way, right? And so I think it's interesting.
King County CPPs, PSRC, and in Olympia. That's a tag word for exclusion,
Yeah,
and we have to be consistent, but we can choose our own words.
Except for character.
Apparently.
Preserving character.
We're going to get comments from them for certification, so that'd be a hard one.
No, I know we spent a lot of time about the equity language before, but specifically to H 1.7. I mean, the phrase, I guess, they're trying to capture is BIPOC. But to tie it back to what we talked about last month about just opportunities for all, I would. And I know, Lois, you had talked about it too, being ethnic. I myself, I feel a little differently about it, and I am Hispanic. So I don't know. I feel like that's really getting very, very specific, and we could just say something homeownership opportunity for all. I mean, all means everyone, regardless of your color, age, gender, anything. It's literally everyone. So I feel like that language is a little too specific for my liking, but curious to know if anybody else has any feelings about that.
I guess I didn't read it that way because they specifically say what they're trying to do is, as a recognition of historic inequities, and those historic inequities did not affect white people. So it's not everyone experienced those inequities. So to me, if the intent of the policy here is to kind of acknowledge the history, then I don't have a problem with how this is laid out. I sometimes struggle with just the spelling out, one version of either BIPOC or BIPOC this or BIPOC that, and just different, like, it's almost like there's a different acronym that's in vogue at different times. I don't mean that to be, critical. It's just like, okay,
Right.
it sounds a little, it doesn't read super well, but in this particular case, I get exactly what they're saying, because I've read those covenants from the city, from a bunch of neighborhoods in the city, and it's hard to read. It's just true and ugly. So I don't have a problem at all with acknowledging that that's the, part of what we're doing is addressing that history. So
I think that we can acknowledge past wrong, which is terrible, and without undermining civil liberties of all of us, and also the so the one that I had highlighted was the H-110. Especially the addressing the impacts of past and present racially exclusive and discriminatory policies, because we cannot, I wish that I could create cosmic justice, which is something that Thomas Sowell talks about. Like, I wish that I could go back and correct the wrongs of the past. But I can't. But we shouldn't move forward. The way that I can think about it is a story from my own family, and I hope that you'll forgive me if it's too long, but my great grandfather immigrated from Canada, from Alberta. He came down and spent 10 years on a homestead saving up money, and his son was very, very ill. So he was going to die if they stayed up there. So he wanted to come to California. In Seattle, on his way down to California, when he went to to change his money from Canadian to US dollars. So this was 10 years of work for him. He was robbed right outside when he exchanged his money, and it took him. Well, life was never the same, and his son ended up not being able to come down and died soon after he got to California. So it was a big deal. Now, if I could meet the grandchildren of the people who robbed my great grandfather, I wouldn't hold them responsible, because everyone is held accountable for their own actions. And I definitely wouldn't want someone who had the same skin color as the person who robbed him to be blamed or suffer consequences. And so that's what I'm getting. I'm uncomfortable about this language and don't know what it means. We don't know what that would open the door to.
Yeah.
And I think that, yeah.
Yeah.
I just want to protect our civil liberties. That's the first priority for all of us,
So this was something brand new that they had suggested, and I think if anybody else has some comments or wants to dissect that piece, I think it'd be good to hear from Christina, probably where she's coming from and what that truly actually means, because like I don't really know. And like, is that a tagline that is in everybody's,
Well, this is from Leland,
or from Leland?
who's well versed in all those meetings at King County here. They were not part of the discussion we had with SCJ.
Okay.
So if they're here on Tuesday night,
Yeah.
they've been updated, but that's different than hearing it
Yeah,
from you. And so if that mirrors the conversation we had with SCJ, those language type items can be adjusted.
okay. Great, so let's definitely talk about that one. Like that.
So then, let me just add something to that, then, to the conversation, because there is, yes, we're not accountable for generations past mistakes. I mean, we didn't cause that, this, right? In this, but there is the neuroscience generational trauma. The science that's coming out in regards to how trauma is actually, essentially given forward in our DNA. So, it's just a complicated conversation. So I'm wondering if there's a way that we can simplify that conversation so that we don't get into that philosophical.
But isn't
stuff,
that
but
the important thing? Because we do have philosophical guardrails
maybe it is.
that protect, then we can have the discussions, but the fact that, you're accused of only crime that you commit is like, that's super foundational. If we let go of that, or if we say, because of your skin color, I can discriminate against you. Well, it's this group this time, but what if, a few years down the road, it's another, and so that's why those philosophical guardrails are so important, because it's like, okay, well, these are the plain rules for all of us. We treat each other equally. Everyone is treated equally under the law, those kind of foundational elements. And if we erode those, then I honestly, their history has shown us what happens. But
I'm not arguing that.
Yeah.
I'm fine on that.
Is it possible maybe, I don't know if a lot of people understand that those covenants were in place. Is it possible to make, I mean, direct reference to that or suggest making direct reference to that? Especially in the HB 1.7, for example, because it talks about historic, it's kind of general, but if we could pull it into a more local, just bring it home, I think that would be a nice suggestion. In general, sorry?
I was just gonna say, in their longer document, they actually provide a map that shows in Lake Forest Park which subdivisions had the covenants. And maybe in the background document is where we would,
I think that's where that map is.
is it?
Correct.
Okay,
But just to highlight it,
okay, was it in the background?
I
Okay.
think so.
Anyway, I agree. I think it would be a good thing to explain somewhere, probably not at this, level of this policy language, but in where they can deep dive, go into it a little more.
just to reference it, just to give people possibly reading this document. Just a general comment. I really, for me, it's really about kindness. That's what I appreciate about the state legislation. It's just creating a society that is kinder. And I know we can talk about race, but it's just one form of not kindness that has existed institutionally. But that's the only comment I want to say. Thank you.
Thanks, Leslie.
It's not in the background volume 2, it's in the racial disparity document,
Okay,
document 4. Anyway.
somewhere in this big packet, I saw it.
Yes.
Just a question about page 3.11. Suppose policies that protect housing security for renter household and Hispanic connections. I'd be curious as to what are some of those protections? Not that we have to have that conversation about that, I'm just curious. From that respect.
Renter household and Hispanic.
Yeah, is this
You mean like-
talking about,
Not kicking out people and.
there's been a lot of stuff around the country around, especially during COVID, around how much you can raise rent, how quickly you can,
Right,
kick somebody out.
payment plans, all that stuff.
Yeah, so I'm curious too, exactly what did they imagine here? So maybe we can flag that as a question
Mhm.
for Tuesday. I mean, it sounds good, but I'm not sure exactly what's in between all the words, or what's behind this.
And that was a totally new policy they added, so yes, I think that's great to talk about.
Okay.
So we want to talk about H 1.1 or point 10. H 3.11.
On policy H 4.3, this reminds me of something I know I've mentioned to sent an email to you, Mark, and to Ashton, I think. I was thinking about just the permanent supportive housing piece, and while I was doing one of those walking tours down the Southern Gateway and looking at the King County Housing Authority property, which is really pretty remarkable. It's a pretty amazing site. And it just got me wondering, is the status of that as a kind of a public housing in any way protected by our code and policies in perpetuity? In other words, could King County Housing Authority, for whatever reasons, maybe good ones, decide to divest of that, and then it's gonna turn into market rate, housing? So I'd like to explore that because it is a big and, they've invested in it, I can tell, so I doubt they're going anywhere, but. It would be nice if we could say that we have something in place to ensure that we're always gonna have some of that kind of housing. And we could say it's there, you know, might need a site specific, you know, zone. Or something, and we probably wanna talk to the housing authority. But I'd like to see that considered so that we don't lose that. Because those are like view properties, those quickly turn into really. You know, somebody would probably tear it down and build, you know, towers for people who can afford it. Just like- Anyway, I don't know when that comes up, but I'd like us to not lose it.
For Tuesday night,
Um,
given last week, this week in Redmond and 2 weeks ago or whatever, and more. It's important topic.
What was it? I know the Kenmore thing was where they kind of. Shot down.
Limit, yeah.
Yeah.
And then Redmond went ahead with North Hotel. A group.
Oh, I guess I missed that over.
I just want to point out, or I don't want to.
No, yeah,
Okay, just on page 44, just an interesting fact, that the data. Most of Lake Forest Park's housing units by single family homes at 82% compared to 52% across the county, 63% statewide. Just thought that was interesting. That's
mhm.
Start.
yeah. I wasn't gonna say that. But yes.
Any other comments on the goals and policy section? We wanna talk about housing background?
Sorry, I already jumped to that.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, sorry, you said it's page 44, but what page numbers on this?
Oh, yeah, that was.
You have a pie chart, right? Oh, here we go, numbers. Oh, wait, that's language, really.
So this starts at on page
21.
21, thank you. So that's where we're at now.
Of the packet or.
What am I missing page? Do you have page numbers?
Yeah.
Did you print off Unicode or like you look at pages?
I don't have change numbers.
Or was that the same?
Yeah, the PDF.
Yeah, if you got the PDF, so when we sent it out, it was like a manually created version.
Oh, that's right.
And
that's
then
right.
we got it to work, and then so that's how the page numbers appear.
So,
Yeah.
so the title.
I'll take your word for it.
Yeah.
What's the title?
Housing background analysis.
Housing background.
Yes.
Okay.
So, yeah. I've been trying to see each 5 months.
Or it's figure 26 in your background analysis.
Yeah. That's what we're at now.
Okay.
I just looked.
A lot of data. Now you can see the difference between volume 1 and volume 2. But volume 1 is so direct and so.
I think what comes up a couple times is that they point out that individuals who own homes now, like first part, I guess speaking to their in retirement, wouldn't be able to afford purchasing a home again in that first part. And if there are just certain things stood out. Well,
That's what a lot of my, friends my age are saying. 10 years, I'm not gonna wanna be in this big house, but I wanna stay in this neighborhood. It's like, write some comment letters to the commission and talk about what kind of housing it takes to do that. Seriously.
Take survey.
Oh, I've sent that around.
Yeah.
Just so you know, we did address those questions during our meeting with our exploration.
Mhm.
That, those conversations came up a lot. You know, we saw ADUs as one way of addressing that lack of opportunity for people to stay in this. Not that it was conclusive or completely, not that it completely addressed the needs, but the conversation's committed, I should say.
Well, I have a friend here in town who wants to develop something like a 6-unit cottage housing development and then pack it with all friends.
That sounds like a story.
Out to retired friends.
There's this group of people on their Instagram, they're retired, they're in their 70s. Friends have been friends forever, and they all live together,
Yeah,
you know, and they make it work, and they just have the most fun with one another. So it's just an interesting concept.
yeah,
Of, you know, how people define family, how people define, you know, what it means to live in retirement, et cetera.
all right.
I think America is where people just separate and they don't stay together as a family. Like, you know, I went to Vietnam with my mom and you would see like 3 and 4 generations.
Yeah.
That are living in the same. house.
Yeah. Yeah,
And they have the little tiny room. Inside, some of them don't even have their own room. So, they're all just. Don't eat a big table, you sit around on the floor.
yeah, when we built our house, we built a wing for my grandma, my like 85-year-old grandmother lived with me as a newlywed. And then my children, so it was, yeah. Any comments on the who we are section? We want to take a look at that.
Didn't spend much time on that because I felt like we covered that ground already some months ago quite a
We
bit,
did.
so I kind of spent what time I had on the deep dive into the stuff. I mean, I appreciate the data and it's good to have this, but I didn't really pick it apart.
Okay.
It'd be interesting to have some of this data be available, like in the city newsletter that goes out, like put out some of the data, bring out some of that data into that newsletter, let people know this is what we learned, this is.
What the community
what
looks
we
like.
think about. Yeah.
Yeah,
It's really good.
yeah, I like that. Okay, where do we want to go?
Racially, sort of tax analysis.
You want to take us off?
Oh, I don't know. It just seems like that's what's next. Right?
Yeah.
Although,
Page
is
number.
everyone okay with moving forward?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Lois, how you doing on there? Hanging in? Perfect. Are you still at work?
No, I just got in late. I'm gonna throw something out at you guys, but I can't help but, you know, with talking about housing, there's such a mismatch of commercial to residential zones in our city, which is truly at the heart of why we are so broke. Anyways, I don't know if you guys would even consider taking, including language that would ask people to consider expanding our commercial zones. I know this is kind of off topic, but and thinking about just I've been meaning to mention that to the group. But since we're kind of at a break, I'll just throw that out there.
I think that's a great comment. I mean, I would echo that too. It's interesting. My husband sells real estate and he has 2 folks that live here in Lake Forest Park that want a building here, have their business here. And there's, actually Skog House was one of them. You guys all know that coffee place. They can't find a location. Ballinger Landscaping is another one and they can't find a commercial location. There's not a lot of zone commercial. So I think that's a great comment, Lois. I don't know
Just-
when, where, how we talk about that, but
Two areas, land, which we already covered,
Exactly.
and economic development, which needs something.
I just wanted to plant that seed to the group since it's significant here. And I know it seems like such a radical idea, but you know, we're always circling, I mean, it'd be curious to see the ratio of commercial to residential cities that have this mismatch where it's so top heavy and residential and how broke they are. And because that really characterizes our city. I would love for us to have, you know, to pay for all this. You know, we're exasperating as Commissioner Bonte had pointed out, to increase the housing load does exasperate our services, whether it's for public safety or for infrastructure. And you know, yeah, we keep circling this topic, but just really to increase to reduce that top heaviness of residential to allow more a taxable tax base by yeah. Sorry, it's been a long day. I've been up since 5. Thank you.
thanks, us.
That's a great idea.
Mhm.
Which also addresses the fact that those who live here, or those who work here cannot live here, right? People cannot
Yeah.
afford, who work here cannot afford to live here. Like, for the most part.
Well, we have in the past, if I'm remembering correctly, preferenced kind of local services or, you know, things like service, you know. Can't remember what the wording is, but not like a business, like a real estate business or a, you know, the business that doesn't focus on the needs of this particular community. So maybe that would be ways that we could change the language to kind of be more broad and types of businesses we look for.
A good reminder that when we get to point right after these very large issue elements, we do have public facilities, economic development, and the policies need to be in the document, but they don't need to be in every element. And so if it's an economic development or a fiscal issue, there are places to park that without redoing housing or redoing land. Remember it for that moment before we come to that big compiled strikeout underlined document.
Alright. Any comments on, so you're talking about key finding, there's questions in this one. You guys want to go to the policy evaluation or any thoughts or comments on that leaving up to there, page 15? So getting into that big table.
Oh, yes. We appreciate that they kind of graded and assigned to these policies. Are we assuming that supportive is it's one level up from approaching?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. But their criteria box is on 15.
Oh, there it is. Yes,
so-
I know that. Yeah.
Support need be insufficient or does not address. Okay, so we had a lot of approaching comments, so they have a lot of notes and suggestions for that. We're on page 16 at the table.
78.
I'm just curious for policy H 1.3, they're saying that the city should consider working directly with communities of color to understand what types of housing would meet their needs. And how do you go about that? Like calling,
I don't know what, Lake Forest Park did last year. There was a grant that the council took advantage of. The word escapes me, it's community-based organizations. That tend to be more regional, not within a city boundary. But they have a unique position to communicate and outreach.
yeah,
And so, we use that grant with 4 other cities to allow those community-based organizations to do this work. And so this is an example of that effort. And this language is policy, but it represents what was required for this very analysis, as opposed to city staff sitting there doing outreach and noticing like we do for a public hearing.
mhm.
Was those community-based organizations that are out in the community providing services.
Okay.
Liaisons. But for every city is different.
So the question I have, well, it goes back to housing. You know, what, I'd like to see some data on how does middle housing, the approach to middle housing thrive or encourage more diversity? Like, would that really like fix Lake Forest Park?
Yeah.
And I'm not opposed to it, right? I think that there is need for middle housing. Lake Forest Park, but I'm just wondering if it's more than that, if it's. Because if we can't address, I mean, I know that we're going to get back to the economic part, but you know, my friend, actually, she was recruited to Microsoft.
She was what?
Recruited to Microsoft, but one of the things that she found in Redmond is that there just wasn't a business that could do her hair, right? That need was there for her, but she was there, you know, they met their need, Microsoft met their need for having, you know, this woman with her expertise and her, but they didn't see her, you know, they weren't meeting their, not that they had, well, actually they do try to meet needs overall. I'm mumbling through this, but I'm concerned that if we're just addressing middle housing without the economics, without the business side of it. I mean, are we spending too much time on middle housing and not enough on the economic side of it? I don't know. It doesn't matter really anyway, because it's the state mandate, so.
Well, and that may be why it seems like we're spending an inordinate amount of time on middle housing. Because that's been the legislation focus for 9 years and continues to be. And was very successful in Olympia, so that's why it seems like we're addressing that, but that other category is entirely open.
And I think it's a valid point though, too. I mean, we could spend a ton of time in middle housing, but if it's not, you know, the most important thing for all of us, and we just want to check a box, then, you know, that kind of can direct our conversations, is what do we do to meet the needs, but I don't know, if somebody feels differently or very strongly about middle housing.
I mean, I agree with you, and housing is a big piece of it, in that if we provide more diversity of housing at different price points and different types of housing options, that will attract a different set of residents and buyers and renters than what we have now, which in turn will hopefully, at least over time, lead to also different types of services, businesses and others that are now serving a more diverse population. So housing can't do it alone. Economic development can't do it alone either. I think it's all those things. I think the middle housing thing is only partly, I mean, it's importantly, but just partly about, you know, racial equity and so forth. I think about young families who want to be able to afford to live maybe where they grew up, you know, and so that just is not possible here pretty much. So So I think it's a really good place for us to spend quite a bit of time, but it's not gonna fix equity by itself, but it will contribute, I think. Because if you just look at the data, if you open your, housing opportunities to, currently this income band can afford to live here. You go like this, and the fact is, there's a strong correlation in income bands and race. So hopefully, we have more options, we'll end up with a more diverse community.
I would just love to see some data but again, every community is different, right?
Yeah.
So Lake Forest Park is going to be different from
Sure.
a suburb of San Francisco. Anyway.
I mean, I think another way to think about it, if you want to see what happens, I think you can look at some other suburbs of Seattle to the south that are very different in terms of their zoning, their kind of landscape, their development history, and they're some of the most diverse communities on the West Coast. Like parts of Tukwila and White Center, they're like, impressively so. So you don't have to, we can't prove that adding houses will lead to this outcome, but we can look at other communities that have a different mix of housing and a business and see that they really do look different. And they're just right there. They're just, half hour down the road.
Yeah, I think that's a good point.
There any thoughts or comments on the areas that are challenging? I mean, have a, policy H 2.1, 2, 3, and 4, those are all presented as challenging with suggestions.
So, policy H dash 2.1.
Yep.
So coming back to that language, right, the character,
Yes.
Lake Forest Park. We're still talking about the quality of Lake Forest Park, and I don't know, a lot of people I talk to, it's about the trees, that's what the quality of Lake Forest Park is about. So what? If we move away from, or when we move away from this language that is exclusive, but we still want to retain the quality of life in the first part. That's not exclusive. What is that replacing?
That's the magic question.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
we know
maybe
it's-
we'll get some of that out of the survey area.
We know it's not character.
We know it's not character. And I'm okay with that. I think that's good.
I think
Right.
that could really help with that.
I think they would say, focus on, kind of form, and what you want to see in the environment. If the trees are important, name the trees, right? That's part of what we want to observe. I think the story behind this kind of so much focus on this term is that just the notion of neighborhood character is like a term of art for a whole bunch of things. White, wealthy, single fam, and we don't want you here. And that's why they're trying to kind of purge this language, because it's not just trees. It's like, I want it to look the way it's looked, and the people look the way they've always looked.
That's clear. That's clear. That the intention behind it is clear.
Yeah, but what do we put in its
What
place?
we do, yeah.
I don't
That's
know.
more than just trees, right?
Right.
It's gotta be more than that. Trees are important to me too, but anyway, we get the point.
And I think it gets, they'll probably recommend focusing on, if we're concerned about the kind of the form and scale of buildings, I think they would say that's a more concrete way to talk about character. Like name the thing you're actually talking about, as opposed to this kind of nebulous, vibe. We want to retain the vibe.
I like where, Lake Forest Park, a couple, some words that come to mind is artistic, creative. You look at, this was also, when you walk around, you'll see the architecture. I mean, these were architects that came and designed their own homes, and I love that. There's so much hidden art all throughout the city too. I mean, so these are, these are, I think, lovely words and ways to characterize the city. Not only is it the natural setting but we also have a tremendous amount of artistic and creativity. Anyways, just a suggestion instead of that can veer it away if you want to specify character, creativity, kindness. I mean, I don't know why we're so afraid of these words, but they're beautiful words.
Other thoughts on the challenging pieces? Sounds like we're gonna have to get some input from them, obviously.
Yeah, 2.3 is interesting. I totally get where they're going, but I think it'll be good for us to hear from them about this.
It's a big package.
So they pack it. Yeah.
You don't want to know my intent. My intent was to throw. Here, here, it's April. I'm glad that we didn't have.
You're gonna give us each an allowance of printer paper or?
Yeah.
One of the, in H 2.2, the private outdoor spaces versus community spaces, and I've noticed that in a couple different places, and anyway, it's not just something that, because I don't think that personal private outdoor spaces are wrong or bad, and so and I don't necessarily think we need to say, well, this one's bad, this one's good. I like community outdoor spaces too. And I like to uphold private property rights and things like that, so.
I think specifically of the Civic Club, I don't know, we are not allowed in the Civic Club because we're outside of the covenant. Our property doesn't lie. But it would be nice to have that word community in there, public and community. I don't know, there's if you guys are members of the Civic Club at all, but that's a real divide within the city itself. Not everybody has access to that lovely waterway, so.
You guys know that? I didn't know that.
What?
No,
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that you had to live in a certain.
Oh,
Oh,
yeah.
I'm not in the, in review,
I didn't know.
across the street from me is, but not me.
Well, the levy-
Long waiting list.
Yeah, well, they don't even have a list now.
Oh, don't they?
Yeah,
Oh,
they've
okay.
done away with that. So it's kind of weird the way the old property lines are marked off, like our neighbor right next to us are deeded. So they can join anytime they want to, but we're not on their property. I mean, it just zigzags around Lake Forest Park.
Yeah,
And I want to say Sheridan Beach Club is also another one that you have to belong to the Sheridan Beach community in order to join that one. And so, I mean, yeah, when we moved here, there was 6 years on the waiting list before we were able to get on. So we're associated member. But, you know, it's just like now, but I have a peeve with that because a lot of the people that with associate membership, you can move out of Lake Forest Park and still be a member as long as you pay your dues. So the families that are here that want to be club member can't because it's so full. And so that's my complaint about that. I've said that probably for lots of years now, because I've seen families that had come through my daycare that can't even get on the list. So they've done away with the list altogether. So yeah, so I mean, we're fearful of getting for membership because we won't be able to get in there again. So who knows? Some days we'll have grandkids, you know, so anyway. But yeah, I think that that's what they're addressing right there when I was reading it.
Okay, I did not even think of that. I was thinking of just my garden, and it's like.
My garden.
Yeah, I'm realizing I need to go look at where this sort of sits in the current complex. The context of this one had me scratching my head. I'm like, what are they talking about here? So I just need to make a note to myself to go back and look at that. This H22 specifically, like what it's about.
Or does it mean, just thinking about our environmental protections, does high quality outdoor space mean all of our trees on the, properties and things like that? Is that what they're going after?
That's big. I mean, I think probably for all the challenging ones, we probably really want to talk to them about that to understand where they're coming from and where we need to be, because we're not hitting the mark with them.
What's the,
What's the
I mean, I know that
recommendation?
they make recommendations, but what is that? Tell what the specifics about.
Yeah. Okay. Question for me, did Matt give you thoughts and suggestions?
No, but, preparing for Tuesday,
Okay,
and she's gonna watch this, catch up, and then by Tuesday, she'll be caught up.
she'll have thoughts, okay, and Melissa also.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So, any other thoughts on those? Didn't have a ton of challenging ones.
I know that I'm on policy H 3.3, it talks about affordable housing. And I would just really love to make sure that affordable housing is open to anyone that qualifies based on their income and not isn't excluded. They were in that income because of their race.
Mm. Yeah. Anybody have comments on that?
Well, I think that, it's not about, Christine was part of that committee last we met, so hopefully she's taking all that into consideration, right? So any instance where, we want to make sure that she is.
But this was
my
Leland.
point.
Yes.
This was Leland.
Yeah. Oh,
This was Leland,
this,
yeah.
that's
Yeah.
right, okay, so, okay, so that's a better point then, right?
Yeah.
They need to hear that conversation.
And we've
For
started
sure,
it and
yeah.
preparing, like, hey, what's coming? Give us some dates.
Yeah.
We brought them up to speed on what we're experiencing, and we said, don't be shocked when we hit this moment, there will be a discussion, this is what it will look like, because we just had it. And so, they aren't privy to that, they weren't associated with that, but when they come here and talk about housing element,
Yeah,
we didn't want to start from zero and have them be surprised, or I think they'll come prepared to have that conversation.
Great.
I know there's many more pages.
Oh, Lord, it's 8:45.
Yeah, but I wanted to do one example of an email that I sent to you today. House Bill 2321 and what that matters as far as these materials being different. Leland being here Tuesday night, these materials not changing, but changing over time. When we get to packet page 98, page 13, 14, 15 in the last document. It talks about tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 cities. One clarification besides the critical area portions, I don't know, we talked about, is the number of housing types that a tier 3 city has to adopt. That's been clarified. It's no longer 6 of 9 or anything like that. So you may see it in these materials, but the clarification we're heading towards is how this new House bill changes that for a tier 3 city. So whether it's ADU, detached ADU, duplex, cottage, we don't need to adopt 6 and have that confusion of, well, your density's at 2. It was awkward. Now it's fixed for us. So they'll be prepared to discuss and modify and show where that affects these documents without spending the weekend changing the actual documents. Okay.
What else you got? Any other things we wanna touch on?
There is one more agenda item. That we need to touch on by 9 o'clock.
Okay, the climate policy advisory.
Yeah. You're prepared for more reading and then Leland Tuesday night. You can cover that. Kind of tags on to Sarah's climate action plan discussion. How do I even pick it up? All right, I'll wing it. Tuesday night, I was at CAC. Last night I was at Tree Board. Tonight I'm at Planning Commission with this same agenda item. It came out of the last city council meeting last week on the 28th. The agenda item was creation of a climate policy advisory team. This is different than the joint meeting discussion we had about CAC. That's a great idea. We don't really have the time or bandwidth right now. We'll hold it off for the future. But we love your climate action plan. We'll grab the policies and put it in the periodic update. Now we add another layer on top of all of that for you. The $500,000 Commerce Grant for Climate Element, different timeline, much, I shouldn't say much longer because it starts basically right now. Last week, the council approved that grant. Mayor signing, so we have that award. The first step in that scope of work is formation of a policy advisory team. It's essentially a task force. So I was tasked with what should that be? And in looking at it, that process to develop a climate element has to involve the planning commission because you do amendments to the comprehensive plan. You're going to do the periodic update, followed very closely by a 2025 what's the word I'm looking for? Optional annual document. Anyway, that's coming. So, and the planning commission's work doesn't stop. It continues with middle housing development regulations and so forth. So while the planning commission has to be involved in that climate element, it's an option to say, and now here's this new layer, give us a climate element, greenhouse gas sub-element, resilient sub-element, go. The CAC just finished the climate action plan, are well versed on the implementation or action items and are ready to go. That's not a policy document. So the idea I had was find a way with volunteers to not add too much burden, but make it functional. In April, we're going to RFQ for the consultant to implement that $500,000. That adds bandwidth to staff. They will perform that scope of work. We'll be there, but we can rely on them to perform it. Instead of putting the full workload on planning commission or the CAC or a whole new, group that isn't up to speed on those two items. The policy advisory team is suggested to be up to 3 members of the planning commission, 3 members of the CAC, 1 member of the tree board, and two general citizens. To have that group to act independently, not compete on your agenda so that you have the bandwidth to do middle housing and so forth. But that can work with the consultant, do all this, and then separately come back and report to the bigger groups. So it is a new team. It's a task force. That resolution went to council on the 28th. They said, we support that. We want to go in that direction, but next week, which is this week, go to these groups, get feedback. So I went to CAC Tuesday night. The feedback was, it's everything we could ask for. Our feedback is favorable. But I didn't ask for specific nominations. I asked them to start thinking about it. I go back next Thursday. I'm going to ask them to waive 3rd reading and hope that they approve the creation of this team. And so the feedback tonight opportunity is planning commission. How do you think about that creation, the workload, the bandwidth, and that style of having that team not compete with your special or regular meetings? Find a night to meet once a month. When I was talking to city council, I think my lesson was, I assumed, of course, everyone's going to want to do this. Everyone has unlimited time. As I was talking, I realized we may not get 3 volunteers from planning commission or CAC, or even 1 tree board. And so that I think is the feedback that council is seeking. If we do this and they set it up, are we going to have volunteers that want to take on that role for a year now, in addition to what they're already doing for a board of commission? So I'm open to any feedback. Tree board was similar. Don't have a nomination, but they want to do it. And the 2 citizen members can come from stewardship or, any group. It's not specific. And so I changed the resolution to read up to 3 CAC, so that we have that flexibility to come up with 7 or 9. 5 tends to be on the small side, too concentrated. Anything over 9, because why don't we just have CAC and planning commission together? So I'm trying to avoid administration, minutes, public records of a new task force, or having to notice a quorum of planning commission and CAC every time it's fall. This is where we're at.
So this work is going to continue through next year.
The deliverables on the grant for the 500,000 are due at Commerce by June 15th, 2025.
Yeah.
The way I have the last item worded is an actionable or draft document. Then the city council can take it, continue discussion, get feedback all the way through 2025. But we need to meet the grant deliverable, because now we're on the line for that. The actual climate element is not required for King County and cities till 2029. So now we are part of the grant. That's a different deadline. It's a lot of work.
Lois. Oh,
Yeah,
sorry.
it would, question, Mark, would this require city staff to administer, record and all that as well, and follow the Robertson rule of, city meetings?
That's correct. Yeah.
Okay, so, wow, that's,
Yeah. But it's an easier burden because we have a consultant that can meet independently with this group. And they're tasked with that scope. I'm already committed to the 2 years. I'll be at whatever meetings, but having this team do it instead of the CAC or PC or combined is actually less work. It's less logistical work. In other words, those boards will continue with the existing staff, and then I'll be at those meetings. Most of the burden will be on the consultant.
I think it makes sense. I would personally consider it. I'd want to think about it a little bit and know about the frequency, but I think that model sounds Good, I think.
I guess just.
Yeah, 100%, I'd support that too. Is he going to get straws?
Yeah, I think the only question I had is just, is that a bigger burden for you guys, but you came up with the idea, so now it sounds like you're in support of that, and
It's less of a burden than any alternative that I could think of.
then. That's great.
And there's no way for existing staff to avoid that work either way. We have the grant, we're going to achieve that. So I'll be there anyway. And it's not a bigger burden for those that support the planning commission. Or Corey that supports CAC. And then that team goes back and does the duty of bringing the other groups up to speed.
So just to clarify your language, are you asking for nominations or are you asking for volunteers?
Both,
Volunteer.
because of time. I can't ask for volunteers or do any of that because we don't actually have a resolution. This is not formed, and the requirement under municipal code for task force is nominations need to be returned to the city council. So next Thursday night, hopefully they waive the third reading, they have a resolution to create it. But I can wait to inform you to start talking or suggest your interests or your non-interests. How many? Because it is a commitment, I don't want to take that too lightly. Now, it will mirror a lot of what you do at planning commission. So it's unique for you because no matter which direction we go in, the climate element amendment to the comprehensive plan is going to be with the planning commission, no matter what. No other group can be tasked with that recommendation.
I think that's a great way to bring the other groups together. I think it's a really good idea. Thank you.
So what?
So do you want to?
If that's a consensus, then my report's already in the packet, goes out tomorrow. When I suggest waiving third reading, and if they take action on the 11th, they'll sign that resolution reform. I don't need to wait till the first week of May. They'll find a way to start nominations and discussions without creating a serial meeting. So forth, knowing that in April, I need to RFQ for a period of time, notice and get a consultant anyway. We're not losing April, but I don't want to start losing May.
Would this committee be involved with the hiring of or the interviews with the potential consultant, or is that something that you'll all take care of?
I've seen both. I don't know what was done with the comprehensive plan. Typically, it's a director and staff, most associated and the city administrator. And the process is pretty formal. Presentation, deadline with material, and then some sort of opportunity for them to present it, and then a ranking and scoring is typically done by a staff. And this is somewhat unique. Climate planning. There's not many groups out there that have this bandwidth. So it's not like we're going to get 10 of them, you know, and it's usually a combination of consultants. My interest is to notice it wide so it's fair, but in reality, we're not going to have much to choose from. If we do, we do, but I just hope we get a few.
Is there a sense that the Leland group is leaning towards this at all, since they've been heavily ensconced in this already? I really like the material coming up. This group.
I'm not that familiar with them, but they're, in my mind, they're primarily housing. And I don't know their consultant group but in theory, if they have that expertise, yes. Cascadia that did the climate action plans, eligible, SCJ. Those are just the ones I could think of. But we won't know until, you know,
The RFQ.
notice the RFQ. And so while I'm doing that, though, you can work on nominations, work with the mayor. That doesn't need to be in a meeting setting, and then we can prep for the beginning of May. So if the consensus is to go with that option or that format, I can convey that to council next Thursday.
You wanna close that?
I'm favorable to that. I know I cannot participate.
I echo that. Or up to 3.
I'd like to, I just don't know.
But yeah, no decisions tonight. I'm just,
Yeah.
I don't want to shock you later in the month, so. If they pass this resolution, we will have a team. I think in their final wording, we'll have the flexibility to create it and not put too much burden on the existing groups. Okay, thank you.
Reports and announcements, anyone? Anything? Any citizen comments? Do we still have? Our NBA. We'll contact Jonathan. Oh, okay. All right, agenda for next meeting, a lot more of this. Maybe add in some climate and transportation.
It's highly likely we won't get fair and Pierce tomorrow. So it would be this same material as is. Leland here, not SCJ. And I'll give you the CAC memo from Sarah without an expectation that we work through it or make any decisions on it on Tuesday.
Also just a quick question about the survey that's gone out. Do you guys have like, do you have an indication of how many people have taken it so far, or?
We know that it's been mailed to the entire city,
Yeah,
and so we're getting some comments.
Yeah.
okay,
It should pick up yesterday and today significantly, but it was, as soon as it went live, there were responses coming in,
yeah, it's great.
so. Printed some extras, I brought half of them tonight. The thought was if you know of interested persons that may or may not have gotten it in the mail or the e-blast, then notify me, the social media options that the deputy city clerk does. The website, every other method that we use.
Yeah.
We actually have these at the front counter and I can give you as many as you want tonight to carry around.
Actually, I would like to.
Okay.
And it's okay to like repost on
Yeah, sure.
moms and families and everyone.
Okay. You can repost some link information to sources, but stay away from reposting with a political agenda.
That's the only way I post.
Oh.
All right, cool. All right, does anyone want to call for the motion to adjourn? Anyone?
Motion to adjourn.
All in favor?
Hi,
Perfect. Thank you.
thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Fine, Lois.
Good night.
Bye.
That's done for the week.